Any animation veteran will tell you that using a bouncing ball for practice when starting out is the way to go. And they're right, but what if I told you you can take your animation practice a step further? This is where Kirby comes along. If you've been watching my channel for the past couple of weeks, you'll notice that I've spent some time creating a Kirby model and character rig in Blender from scratch, and that wasn't just for the fun of it. The deeper I get into my animation journey, the more I realize how important it is to master the fundamentals. Now, it might sound like a cliche, but it's true. Like any other art form, animation is a layered process. It begins with a simple block out. Just like I said in my Akali animation video, before animating your actual rig, you must block it out with a bouncing ball first. It helps you figure out timing and spacing, but sometimes that's just not enough. Most characters you and I will animate will probably be humanoid characters with arms and legs, and it's hard to visualize with a simple bouncing ball. Now, over the holiday season, I was playing some Super Smash Bros., and that's when it hit me. Kirby is actually the perfect bouncing ball block out character. It was a Christmas miracle. His body consists of a bouncing ball, but he's also got arms and feet that allows you to better visualize the final animation and also count the right amount of frames for follow through and overlapping actions when going from one pose to another. So I got to work and decided to create a Kirby character rig in Blender from scratch. If you're interested in the process, you can check the video out in my channel. If you just want the final Kirby rig right out the box, you can find the download link in my description. I'm giving it away for free. Now, before we get to the actual animation, we have to set up our scene. So after appending the Kirby rig into the scene, I added in a plane so we can visualize the floor. I added the solidify modifier to make it thicker, so it's easier to click on. I also added a camera and added a viewport that is seen only through the camera's lens. This is very important since you want to have an idea of what the animation will look like on screen right from the beginning. And lastly, there will be some props involved like rocks. I just created cubes with random shapes and sizes and parented them to an empty so that they can all be animated through one controller. I used stretched out icospheres for the rocks that Kirby will kick. So when I made this tutorial, I made sure to keep it as simple as possible. Now keep in mind that today isn't about how to make a final rendered animation, but more like how to quickly block out an animation with the Kirby rig. This means that the props used in the video are all basic and that the shading engine used is Blender's workbench renderer set to flat, meaning it's as simple as possible. We're only focusing on the animation today. Keep in mind though that the textures only appear once they're baked in as image textures. They won't appear through procedural shading nodes. And with my scene set up, I was ready to get into animating. Now, if I had to take a guess, I'd say that if you're watching this video, your animation level is probably around the beginner to intermediate scale, sort of like me. Animating directly through a full-on character rig can get messy at first. There's so many controllers to manage through, especially if you're still new to the rig you're using, and all of those complexities can create a mental block when animating, but not with Kirby. I went with a very brief idea for the animation: Kirby earthbending. He jumps, lands, and summons rocks from the ground and smashes them away with his kicks before becoming the rock himself. After etching out a very simple sketching of what I wanted from this animation, I immediately keyed his first pose and began to place keyframes from there. His bouncing ball body is so simple, he becomes a very intuitive character to animate. Basic principles like squash and stretch, ease in, ease out, and follow through and overlapping become much more easier to manage, therefore much easier to practice. And this is what this is all about, making animation as easy as possible to practice. So with the animation practice underway, I started posing Kirby and moving keyframes around to adjust the timing of the actions. I made sure the keyframes are all set to constant interpolation and kept replaying animations, thinking about future poses and how fast he gets to them. The faster Kirby moves means the more stretched he'll become when transitioning to the next pose. Like here, for example, when he's in the air and about to smash down on the ground with a hard landing. There's also a logic that follows with that. The longer his stretch, the tighter his squash when he gets into the next pose. But not only that, but when he squashes down on the ground, there's some recovery time. He doesn't just squash and go into his next pose. His body recovers from the hard landing. That takes up a few frames. Not only that, but we also need to hold on to the pose to give a proper amount of time for the rocks to jump out from the ground. We're not just animating Kirby, but also his environment. Everything must be taken into account when animating. Another challenge I faced was when I had to turn on or off Kirby's feet follow feature and maintain maintain the feet's location. I went over it with my last video on how I made Kirby, but essentially there are times when I want to move the feet independently from the body, or move the body without having the feet to follow his movements, and I created a control for that in my rig. The thing is that when I perform a switch from on to off or vice versa, the feet might have been moved in an awkward position because of its set location value, and we don't want that. I want the switch to be seamless and have the feet remain at the same location when triggering the feet follow feature. The solution? Add 2 empties for each feet. Tag them as left or right as not to get confused. Add to each one of them a copy transform constraint targeting the feet's controllers. Apply the constraint, then turn off the feet follow feature in the rig. Then add a copy transform constraint on the feet controllers targeting the empties and apply them. Once the feet are on the correct location, simply keyframe them and there you go. The feet's follow feature has been switched without losing the feet's location. And from there I kept plowing through with my poses and filling the space in between them. This is the nitty-gritty part of animation where you simply have to push through, placing key poses, guessing how to pose in between them, and going through some trial and error phases. A tool that always helps me with my arcs is by using the motion paths feature. A tip that I can give in these moments is also to really work on your animation section per section. For me, this allows me to give the proper amount of focus on each part of the animation. Although we always go back and forth in our animations, it can't be helped sometimes. Animation is a non-linear art form after all. But yeah, this is the part that took the most amount of time, just posing and filling keys in between them. I also animated the camera as I was blocking Kirby, since this will affect how I decide to pose him. I'm not animating him for the viewport, I'm animating him for the camera. When Kirby transforms into a rock, I simply created a rock mesh and painted some eyes on and switched meshes by animating their viewport and rendering visibility feature in the outliner. Once my blocking was looking complete, I began to spend some time on other elements of the animation, like the VFX. Now, this animation in particular doesn't have a lot of them, but one of the main ones is when Kirby transforms into a rock. Now, based on the Super Smash Bros. Animation, I added cutting effects around Kirby as he transforms. To achieve this, I created 2 empty circles and made a plane follow its path through the curve modifier. Then I made those planes move forward on the x-axis only so that they follow the circle's paths, and that's how I created the effect. To make it appear and disappear, I simply animated its viewport and render visibility features in the outliner. For the dust cloud, I decided to wait after splining because I wasn't 100% sure on how I'd make it yet. Now that the blocking was done, it was time to move on to splining. But first, take a day off. Letting your brain relax and forget the animation so that you can view it with a pair of fresh eyes the next day is just as important as key posing. Without being able to view it from a proper critical standpoint, how can you make the right decisions to propel your animation further? So when you return the next day and get ready to spline, start doing it section per section. I started with Kirby's initial movement when he's taken a step back, then moved on to the jumping, then onto the landing, etc. Just select the amount of keyframes that determines the animation section you want to spline and change their interpolation to Bezier, and leave the rest to constant. Just like that, step by step. Same as with blocking, splining also involves some backs and forths and having to plow through the process. Except that instead of having to put new key poses, this time you're polishing them. Splining means you'll be spending a lot of time in the graph editor. A shortcut I like to use a lot is Shift+H, as it allows me to isolate the one curve I'm working on. As always, we're trying to make things as simple as possible so we can execute the idea and action as correctly as possible. Also, I would go back and forth with the camera's animation as well, as I'm making sure its movements match Kirby's new timing as well. Same for the props. Now that splining is looking a lot better, it was time to work on some refinement and switching props around. Starting off with the refinement, I decided to give Kirby a blink or two. I added some key shapes to his eyes, and one of them is eyes shut, so I made him blink by animating it. I also added some smears on him during his hard landing to emphasize how fast he was dropping. Same for his foot before his second kick, except this time I did it by scaling up his foot controller. As for the props, I decided to switch them around a little like the rocks that Kirby kicks. I also baked image textures for all meshes involved since, as mentioned before, the Workbench render engine doesn't work with procedural shading nodes and only image textures. I also added smears on the rocks when Kirby kicks on them to give the illusion of speed. And lastly, I made the cloud of dust during its transformation by adding in a cube with some subdivision modifiers and displacement modifier. I gave the displacement modifier a Voronoi texture to create the look of a cloud and animated it with an empty, and there you go. I completed the animation exercise in about 10 hours or so. I really hope you found this useful. I'm curious to know what kind of difficulties do you encounter when trying to animate, and if you also find blocking out an animation with a Kirby type of character better than a simple bouncing ball to better visualize your final animation. Let me know if you have any questions about this animation or in general, and it'll be a pleasure to answer you. Leave it in the comment section below and I'll answer it as fast as I can. If you like this tutorial, you can check out my channel for more. If you like this Kirby rig, you can check out how I created him in this video right here. Or you can simply download it by clicking on the link in the description. And if you'd like to watch my other animation tutorial involving Akali, you can click right here to watch it. Peace!